During the late hours of October 30th, 1975, Martha Moxley's life was snuffed away. Her body would be found the next day, the murder weapon seeming to be a Tony Penna golf club. After numerous investigations into her death, her case would remain closed for about 20 years. That is, until one day when former prosecutor for the infamous O.J. Simpson case would release a book explaining who he believed was Moxley's killer. Suddenly, with newfound interest, the case was reopened, and Moxley's neighbor, Michael Skakel, was put on trial for the murder. Skakel's trial was anything but ordinary. I mean, that is to be expected when you're the nephew of one of the most infamous and powerful families in the United States, the Kennedys. Since there was no physical evidence linking him to the murder, due to the fact that the murder had happened 20 years prior, the prosecution was dependent on the fact that former classmates had confessed that Skakel had told them he committed the murder. What the prosecution didn't expect was that these classmates would also use this trial as an opportunity to expose the horrible acts the school would impose on them. See, Skakel didn't go to a normal high school. At the age of 16, he was arrested for drunk driving. And the courts gave him two options. Either he could go to prison, or he could go to a reformatory school called Elan and have no prison time. His parents chose the latter. So, Elan is not your typical 8 to 3 school. It was designed to help troubled teens of all walks of life better themselves into becoming productive members of society. So, how did they do that? Well, for that, we must go to the three men who founded the school, all the way in the early 70s. The 70s were a time known for their bright colors, popularity of disco, and excessive weed usage. But there was something brewing underneath, too, the troubled teen industry. See, the 70s were also the rise of the hippie movement, an anti-war, pro-peace, anti-establishment movement who wanted to defy authority in every step of the way. These would be like the rebel kids of that age. So how do you stop rebel kids in their tracks? You demonize their behavior and create an industry so that parents could get their kids to be de-radicalized. Suddenly, hundreds of thousands of these centers were popping up everywhere. And Elan was one of them. See, Elan was founded by psychiatrist Gerald Davidson, a professor at Harvard with a PhD, and investor David Goldberg, and executive director of the school, Joseph Ritchie. Let's talk a bit more about Ritchie. Ritchie was also the public figure of the school, since he frequently was seen talking to the press. He had connection to multiple levels of government, and he even had 2 runs for state governor in Maine. Ritchie was an interesting man. He was a former heroin addict who was able to beat his substance abuse issues by joining the Daytop Village Center in New York. While there, the method used to help its constituents was attack therapy. Attack therapy is described as putting a patient in a group setting where peers will attack and ridiculize them on the problems they are currently facing. This form of therapy was popularized by the cult of Synanon, which is a whole nother topic I will not get into. It is a very big mess. This was popularized by the cult of Synanon in the late 50s, correct? So, while the cult did lose steam in the 70s after the arrest of its leader for a lot of bad things, its reach has still persisted to this day in rehabilitation communities. As one of the success stories of Daytop, Ritchie sought to become a leader in that community, saying that something just clicked inside him while there. And while he did agree with the methods used to help his constituents, he did not like the lack of formal education these centers didn't give. So, After pondering for this for some time, Richie encounters Dr. Gerald Davidson, and together they purchase land in Maine to help create what is now known as Elan. Richie explains that just like how Daytop helped him, he hopes to help others with substance abuse issues. See, Elan didn't start as a school for troubled teens. It started as a rehabilitation center just like Daytop, just like Synanon. Later, after the success of the first year, they decided they can help more teens. And it's important to know, Elan started for people over the age of 20. Afterwards is that they started helping teens. So the problem with Elan after these years was the fact that it was not working just as a rehabilitation center for people with substance abuse issues. It was working as a rehabilitation center for everything. It didn't matter if you were there for a murder. It didn't matter if you were there because you have been found guilty of rape by the justice system. It didn't matter if you were there because your parents caught you smoking weed once. It didn't matter if you were there if your parents caught you holding hands with a boy. Elan planted itself as the solution to all your parents' problems. One catch. There's just one catch. The tuition fee, $54,960. So, for that tuition, what exactly did you get? Well, according to Elan, they would help you solve all the problems through group therapy. See, Elan claims they had psychologists, but when you talk to former survivors, everyone tells you they never saw a psychologist. They just had their group therapy. Or in group therapy, you would scream. You would scream about your problems to your fellow classmates, to your fellow housemates. It made you expose the most intimate parts of yourself to them, and then those people could ridicule you about them. Elan thought that this form of therapy can help people, since a lot of them would see how meaningless their problems actually were. They'd think, they'd scream about how my parents don't love me, yada yada yada. People would scream back, well, maybe they'd love you if you were a better person, if you weren't so lazy. And Elan thought that by hearing these things, people would be striving to become better. Which kind of has some issues in and of itself, but okay. So, these group sessions, they weren't the only forms of therapy at Elan. In fact, one could argue you were always in therapy in Elan. You see, Elan's system was built so you were always on edge. You were always gonna be getting help from your housemates. One of these forms of help was called a general meeting. What's a general meeting? I'll explain. If you were doing your job, you had to clean the house. And for some reason, you didn't do it correctly or you talked to someone you shouldn't have. One of the higher-ups would scream, "General meeting!" What happens here? Everyone stops what they're doing. Everyone stops what they're doing. They're going to put a pole in front of you. And everyone in that house is going to take turns screaming at you. When I mean screaming at the top of their lungs. And screaming how much you're a terrible person, how you don't deserve to be here, how much they're going to kill you for disrupting the community. And these general meetings could last for hours. If they'd call you slurs, they'd call you names. They'd wish death upon you. And it wasn't optional to participate. If you didn't participate, you could get a general meeting yourself. So you had to scream at the person. Even if you didn't want to, you'd have to scream at the top of your lungs how much you hate them and wish they died. Well, a lot of times after the end of these general meetings, the victims would start crying. They'd be bawling their eyes out at the end of it, wishing for it to stop. Impressively, this wasn't even the worst thing to happen. Elan also had something called the ring, which sounds pretty ominous. It is pretty ominous. So the ring was a circle of people who, if you weren't just responding to a general meeting, they'd throw you into the ring. They'd make a human circle around you, and then they'd place you in, and they'd say, in this corner is Badagada, and in this corner is Elan's champion, and you would box. And maybe you'd think, okay, if I box him, then I win. Problem solved. No. You box him, and if you win, they'll send a new person. And if you win against that new person, they'll send another. And they'll keep sending people until you're on the ground begging for them to stop. It was an abusive system. So it wasn't made for you to never win. Every time you won, a newer, stronger person would take their place. And they would keep doing that until you succumb to their will. Because you tried to defy the system. You can't defy the system. Another famous punishment in Elan was sitting in a corner, which honestly, after describing the ring, sounds pretty harmless. Except it wasn't the normal corner. I know what you're thinking when you think the corner, because I had that too. You disobey your parent, you disobey your teacher. They tell you, go sit in the corner and think about what you've done. You go to the corner, you sit there for 5 minutes, thinking like, oh no, I'm so bad. Everyone's looking at you. Maybe they snicker behind your back. Whatever. 5 minutes pass. You go back to your chair. Everything's okay. That was not Elan's corner. In Elan's corner, if you were sent to it, you would go to it, sit, corner, okay, nothing out of the ordinary, and then you would stay there for days, if you're lucky, staring at the same corner all day, every day, for a couple days. If you were very bad, maybe a month. If you were a terrible person, you could stay up to 6 months. And I'm not saying that as like this is an estimate of maybe that happened. I'm saying that as someone who watched the documentary where survivors explained that the most they saw someone sitting in a corner was 6 months. Now imagine that. Sitting in a corner, staring at the same wall every day, the same wood, the same blotches, the same paint, the same cockroaches, all day, every day. And this wasn't even the worst part of the corner. The worst part was that people could come in and berate you. They could scream at you. They can make you feel worse about yourself than you already did while being in the corner. And you could do nothing. You couldn't look back. You couldn't talk back. You just had to sit there and watch the corner. The troublesome thing about Elan wasn't just the harsh punishments, but the system as a whole. Okay, so picture this. You were out one night and you got caught by the cops. You went underage drinking. You're 16 and your friends were like, oh, let's have a drink, whatever. And you get caught by the cops. You get arrested. Your parents start looking at you differently. They're like, I can't believe my kid did this. Ring, ring, ring. Who is that? Elan's calling your parents. Elan's calling your parents, and they start telling them about how they've heard about your kid. They've heard about what has happened to them. They're the solution. They know how to fix your kid. They know how to make them never go down that path. And if you don't choose Elan, your kid will die. Your kid will become a heroin addict and they'll die on the street. You're panicking as a parent. You're like, oh, what if my kid does happen to my kid? Am I a terrible parent? What happens? So you pay the tuition, $54,000. Maybe you'll have to pick up a few extra shifts at work, but it's all to save your kid. What is the cost of a human life? You'll pay anything. So how do you get to Elan? See, Elan was in Poland, Maine. So if you lived in Idaho, California, how exactly do you get there? Well, there's two ways. If you were a good kid, your parents could just drive you there. Parents will tell you, oh, this is summer camp. Because a lot of parents didn't understand what exactly went down in Elan. So they'd say, oh, this is like a nice summer camp. You'll just be here for a couple months. You're like, okay, pack your bags, take them to your car, vroom, vroom, vroom. You drive up to Poland, Maine, and then you realize this is not how they told you it would be. But that's not the worst part. The worst part is if you were deemed a flight risk. Flight risk is that they wouldn't go. If they would know what was happening, if they know, like, oh, my parents are sending me to a reformatory school, they'd run away. Which makes sense. If you were deemed a flight risk, Elan would personally come to your house in the middle of the night and kidnap you. And I'm not saying this like as an exaggeration. They would actually like take you out of your bed, throw you in a van, and drive you up to Poland, Maine. That would be the way they would send you there. And this wasn't just specific to Elan. A lot of reformatory schools do this. The most famous one I can think of is Paris Hilton talking about how she was basically kidnapped when she was sent to reformatory school, and she still has nightmares about that. So, okay, you get kidnapped. You're in this van. You're freaking out. What the hell is happening? I'm getting trafficked. What am I gonna do? And you get sent to this weird place in the middle of the woods and off number 5 road in Poland, Maine. So of course, the minute they let you out of the car, you try to run away. Any sane individual would. Except you can't run away. There are guards stationed all around the woods, and the moment you reach the woods, you're gonna get tackled, and you get brought back. So what happens after this? They take you to the shower. This is a co-ed dorm. They can't have you giving people lice. Give you the shower. They strip off all your clothes, which is really a violation of privacy. And if you're a boy, unlucky, you get shaved. Your head gets shaved off. If you're a girl, all your jewelry is taken off. And they give you plain clothes. See, having an image in Elan is a privilege. It is not a right. If you were deemed a flight risk, since you had already tried to escape, they take the laces off your shoe. You can't run. You can only walk. So after this, you're kind of confused a bit. You're like, what the hell is happening? They took my clothes, they took my jewelry. What is happening? They take you to the cafeteria. It's dinner time. You sit down and you look at the person next to you and you tell them, what is this place? This is so weird. And suddenly, boom. General meeting. Everyone's screaming at you. Everyone's telling you you're a terrible person. What did you do? Why are you getting punished? What you didn't know was that in Elan, socializing was another privilege. See, everyone was divided into classes. You had your strengths and you had your non-strength. Since you just arrived, you were a non-strength. So strengths can communicate with other strengths and non-strengths. Non-strengths can only communicate with strengths and only if they're talked to. So why the division between strength and non-strength? Because the prisoners run the prison in Elan. It's also very important to know everyone in Elan had a job. That is why there is the division of class. You were a non-strength, so your job was cleaning. You had to clean the floors, you had to clean the toilets. Brush, brush, brush. Strengths had different positions. You could either be a coordinator, you could be house manager, you could be one of the night owls. Because nothing in Elan is a right. It's a privilege. So sleep, another privilege. But I don't need to say a privilege because no one got sleep. Night owls were made so that every night they'd have to check if everyone's on their bed multiple times a night. Like every 5 minutes, someone's going to flash a light in your eye to see that you're sleeping and that you have not escaped. So, strengths. What other jobs they had? They had the house manager, where they managed all the house. They gave all the jobs. They had the type of police where everyone, if you were in the police section, you had to be stationed at the doors so that people didn't leave the room they were supposed to. There was the general managers, etc., etc. So you were either the enforcers, the managers, or since you're non-strength, the cleaners. So, can you go up? Yes. If you follow the program. If you follow the program, you'll go up and up and up, and maybe you'll even get to house manager. But one wrong mistake, and you'll get shut down. Get a general meeting, start from zero, scrubbing toilets with a toothbrush. So, what other ways did you get punished? You might be made to wear humiliating signs or costumes. An example of this, in the documentary I've kept mentioning, was wearing a whore costume. Someone held hands with a boy, and they were made to strut around like a prostitute. It was embarrassing for her, and it was embarrassing for everyone, and then everyone had the chance to scream at her. Apart from this, they made you write your guilt down. So, what is guilt? Guilt is basically everything that you think would break Elan's rules. So maybe it's that you looked at little Johnny there and you thought he was cute. That broke Elan's rules. You talked to a non-strength when you weren't supposed to. That broke another rule. You were supposed to scrub the toilets, but you didn't. You gave up. You broke another rule. And these were supposed to be private. I also want you to know that you couldn't just evade writing down your guilt. You had to write it down, or else you'd get a general meeting. But the thing is that even though you wrote your guilt down, they would use that guilt as ammo during your therapy sessions. They'd scream about you and humiliate you for the things you wrote in your guilt. It's like nothing was private in Elan, to the point where if you wanted to send a letter to your parents, you had to send it through Elan coordination first. They'd have to, and they'd edit it to the point where it wasn't even you talking, it was the institution. Another way they invaded your privacy, they monitored every call you made. There was only one phone in Elan. Went through a little base there that they had there, and if they heard you say anything bad about it, they'd shut down the call before you were able to, before your parents could hear what happened. So to recap, Elan uses physical and emotional abuse to help their constituents. So how were they not caught by authorities? Well, it's pretty simple. Maine has a law, which I'm not sure if it's still in effect, but it had a law, where government services were to announce their arrival 24 hours prior to their visit. So every time the state came to do a checkup, they'd have to ring, ring, ring. Hello, Elan? Yes, we're coming tomorrow. So what would Elan do? Hide all their bad students and only keep the strengths in campus. They'd change all their behavior. No general meetings, no rings, no nothing. Everything was made so that Elan looked perfect. It was helping students. See all these good students? Johnny here was a drug addict before he came to Elan. And look at him now, an outstanding member of community. And I'm not saying this as like, this is a theory I have. No, this was like a fact. See, a psychologist neurologist heard that New York was sending kids with disabilities, to Elan. And they called the state of New York and they told them, do you know what happens at Elan? Why are you doing this? Why are you doing this? You're emotionally torturing these kids. So what does New York decide to do? They decide to investigate, and since they're not a governmental facility from Maine, they didn't give their 24 hours notice. They just went to the campus where they saw kids being hit, they saw kids being screamed at, they saw kids living in dumpsters. After this, they decided no more kids are going to be sent to Elan. I want you to guess when this was. So Elan's been working since the 70s. Maybe it was the 80s. The 90s? No, it was 2008. They finally decided to investigate the school in 2008. Imagine how many kids could have been saved if they just investigated sooner. So I keep talking about Elan and saying, oh, this is child abuse, this is child abuse, this is child abuse. But what exactly does child abuse constitute as? The Department of Human Health describes child abuse as any recent act or failure to act on the part of a parent or caretaker which results in death, serious physical or emotional harm, sexual abuse, or exploitation. It is also defined as an act or failure to act which presents an imminent risk of serious harm. So can this be applied to Elan? I have a few examples because I've talked about the punishment, but I just want to talk about some victims and how much they were traumatized by this. A kid was sent to the ring. As I explained, the ring, the boxing ring. They were sent there. They went bam, bam, bam. Maybe they won the first or second round. I'm not sure. There's not a lot of information. They boxed their life out. What happened to the kid? He died. He's dead now. Elan told his family it was a brain aneurysm, and that since he faked them all the time, they didn't realize it was a real one. And the state never investigated. A kid died under their watch, and they never investigated why this happened. The only reason this ever came to light was because one of the people who was in the ring called the family because they were so full of guilt, and they told them he died because he was put in the ring. He died because they beat him up. So maybe this was a one-time thing. It was just a terribly, unfortunate incident. What other examples are there? Well, it's pretty easy. In the 70s, there was a girl named Kim. She testified in the Skakel trial, actually. So Kim, what happened to her? She got a general meeting. She was not getting accustomed to Elan. And in the middle of the general meeting, she got a mental breakdown. She broke down. She had a nervous breakdown to a point where she peed herself. She was not there mentally. And witnesses have said she was not there. There was nothing behind her eyes. So Elan, they saw this. They freak out. Okay, maybe, I mean, that's what you think, you know? They realize like, maybe we went too far. We need to stop. No. What do? They send her to the showers, fully clothed. They throw water on her. And maybe that's it. Maybe they just want to shower her. Wrong. They put her back in the house. And what do? They hit her. 6 or 7 people start spanking her to the point where she has bruises all over her. What happens to Kim? She leaves Elan. Her parents send for her, and she leaves. She was not there at the end. She broke. How does this happen? This wasn't just them. There were so many other people who had just the same incident. So the people who were 6 months in the corner, do you know how much psychological damage that can give you? Having no human contact for 6 months, having to look at the same place all day, every day, you'll lose your mind. And it's not just this, it's all of it. Elan was it was something else. You couldn't socialize. Everything was a privilege. You got punished for nothing. You got screamed at, you got ridiculed. No one listened to you. You had no privacy. These kids were emotionally stunted. And it's not even that. Depriving a kid of their education is also child abuse. You cannot deprive kids of their education. You will CPS will come for you. Elan's education was so poor that one of the survivors explains that it wasn't actually teachers. You had your teacher, yeah, but most of them just gave you the book and you auto evaluated yourself. So okay, you did your little homework and you thought you deserved an A. Survivors have said they left Elan so poorly, like their education was so poor they couldn't even read well. They couldn't even read well. You're 18 leaving this facility and you couldn't even read. That that affects a child. That affects a person. That is child abuse. So why didn't people catch on sooner? People just didn't believe them. See, Elan took all walks of life. It was murderers, it was serial rapists, but it was also kids who smoked pot, kids who held hands. So when you group all these kids together, everyone thinks, oh, you're just a bad kid. They think you're the bad kid. You couldn't be trusted in your words. It's also important to remember that mental health, even to this day, is still a taboo. In the 80s and 90s, it was gonna be way worse. Like it was worse. Like it was a worse taboo. So most parents just didn't want their kids to be labeled as crazy. They'd rather them be labeled as a bad kid who can be fixed, because a mentally ill kid, yes, you can better your illness, but you can't cure it per se. Like there's gonna be a part of you who's that's always gonna have it. You can fix a bad kid, but mental illness takes a lot more work. Parents just could not deal with that fact. They didn't want to have the crazy kid. And also, it wasn't just that parents didn't want to have a crazy kid. As I keep saying, Elan's system was built so you couldn't leave it. Like it was built so that no one could defy it. An important part of this was the contract your parents signed. And this isn't just like specific to Elan. This is specific to a lot of rehabilitation centers. If you were to sue Elan after you got out of there, you would sue your parents. And I know that sounds really weird. So basically, if you were to sue that institution, Elan's financial troubles while dealing with the lawsuit will be with your parents' money. So basically, your parent would have to pay for Elan's defense, and if you were to get a payout, it would be your parents' money. A lot of kids won't do that, of course. What kid would want to sue their parent? That's like, it is definitely like a manipulation so that they wouldn't get sued. Like I would never sue my mom. I could not deal with that, like the emotional turmoil. So okay, I've been talking about Elan all this time, and you're probably like, oh my god, this institution still exists. Can we do something to stop it? So, luckily, Elan shut down. Elan shut down in 2011, not because of any laws or anything, but because of the massive online campaign of ex students that called out the school and said it was terrible and exposed all the brutalities that happened there. And it officially closed its doors because a lot of parents would now go to the internet and see just how bad this institution treated kids. Elan's past basically came to haunt it. So, why am I talking about this? The case is closed. It finished. I'm talking about this because For-profit rehabilitation institutes still exist. They're still here. They're You don't know it because we're like the good kids. We never got sent to them. But there are tens of thousands of people still there. Paris Hilton, again, I keep bringing her up. She's an example of a survivor. Her rehabilitation institute drugged kids when they started misbehaving. You cannot drug a kid. That's not something you can do. They also kidnapped her to the point where she still has night terrors about it. She's actually an avid supporter of stopping these kinds of institutions. And it's not just her. Social media has shown me time and time again countless survivors explaining their story of how they got out of this troubled teen industry. I've heard of some in Utah, in Wyoming, and all these places. Actually, famously, every time Dr. Phil says, "You're getting sent to the ranch," the ranch is a rehabilitation institute. Danielle Bergoli, I don't know if you know who that is. She's the Cash Me Outside. How about that girl? She was sent to a rehabilitation institution where she said multiple times that she was violated. She was abused. You should not be able to scream at kids for hours on end to the point where they break down, to the point of a nervous breakdown. You shouldn't be able to put kids in a corner for 6 months in isolation. You shouldn't be able to let them live in a dumpster for months on end. You shouldn't be able to shackle kids. You shouldn't be able to make them fight each other to the point of death. You shouldn't be able to abuse kids. Plain and simple. These rehabilitation centers do all of that. And they should not be able to do this. This is child abuse, plain and simple. If a parent did half the stuff these institutions did, CPS would be there so fast they couldn't even say goodbye to them. There are institutions that fight against this. One of them, the youth rights organizations, they've launched campaigns for Congress to enact laws. Congress has actually started doing this. The House has passed down 2 bills to enact laws against these types of institutions. It just nothing comes of it. So what I wanted to do with this was shine a light on these problems, because this is still basically a crime that is ongoing. And I want to be able to shine a light here so that maybe these kind of exposure can help save these kids. It's something. I don't know. It's unfair. It's unfair to them. It's unfair to all of us. I think it's unfair that this is happening to this day and that kids don't have these types of rights. So that was the point of this entire project, to talk about an ongoing crime that is happening against the kids of today, of yesterday, and of the future. Thank you for listening. So after this video, I also wanted to say thank you to Jessica Adams. Honestly, this class was amazing. I had a lot of fun with it. You were an amazing professor. Honestly, I enjoyed all the works. So that's why I always pass the limit, which I'm very sorry, and also pass the limit. In this video, this is a 40-minute video. I am so sorry. I just, I want to give all the information. But honestly, thank you for being such an amazing professor that let kids express their creativity. And I hope you have a great rest of your life. Honestly, thank you for everything. Thank you. Thank you.